Good morning. All right. How's everybody doing today? Good. I got one great, one good. Not a bad start. Well, first of all, welcome to Gallup. My name is Brandon Busteed. I'm an executive director for education and workforce development, and I'm really excited to talk about the results of the work that we've been doing with Western Governors University. This is work that we've been doing over the last few years with the institution, helping them as a third party measure the outcomes of their alumni, which is something that they've taken very seriously and is an important part of the framework of their work. So what I'm going to do in the first 10 or 12 minutes or so is just give you a very high-level overview of some of the key results in the study that we did most recently this year, which looked at their graduates from 2013 to 2017. So these are very recent graduates. We're going to show you comparisons among WGU alumni in that time frame to alumni nationally and across different types of cohorts from different types of institutions, and even comparisons to other non-traditional age college graduates, because as many of you are probably aware, WGU is an institution that primarily serves adult learners. And so you'll note in the full report that the median age of alumni in this study for WGU is about 42 years old. There's a comparison group of non-traditional age graduates where that median age is about 39, so a much more comparable age cohort comparison. And then after I share some of the results, we're going to open it up to a great panel discussion, and believe me, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A with the audience. I have only one question for the panel, which means right now that I'm prepping all of you to think about what questions you want to ask, and we will be going to the audience for that. So first of all, we're going to start with job outcomes. We know that the top reason why people attend college, and this is through survey research that Gallup has done with partners like Strata Education Network and Lumina Foundation, no matter what group you interview, whether it's college freshmen, parents of 5th through 12th graders, the general population, the top reason why people value college in the United States is to get a good job. It's not the only reason, right? We value college for many reasons, but the top reason, far and away, among every group we've ever surveyed, is to get a good job. So the first thing we want to report on is how are WGU graduates doing on that? And we look at it through a couple of different metrics. Let's start with how the Bureau of Labor Statistics would look at this through the definition of employed full-time for an employer. And you can see that 83% of WGU graduates of this recent cohort that we studied of 2013 to 17 are employed full-time for an employer. This is 20 percentage points higher than any other comparison group that we've looked at within the study. So you can see graduates nationally, and that would be all other graduates nationally, graduates from public universities, private nonprofit, and then also the comparison group I mentioned to you, which is non-traditional age graduates, which obviously are a closer comparison age group-wise to the WGU alumni. So considerably more likely to be employed full-time for an employer. We also know that based on qualitative measures of their work, so not just are they employed, that's an important metric, but Gallup goes a little deeper in that in measuring a number of questions about the quality of that work. Are they engaged in that work? Are they emotionally connected to their work and their workplace? And on those metrics, we roll that up into an overall category that we call engaged at work. And you can see here that WGU alumni are much more likely to be engaged in their work, so not just employed full-time, but also engaged in that work compared to all the other categories. And interestingly enough, you might say, well, yeah, for young graduates, maybe they're struggling to find jobs that are a really good fit for them, so on and so forth. But again, here, it's a really important comparison to look at those non-traditional age graduates as well, substantially less likely to be engaged in their work than WGU graduates are. And you'll see there's some interesting insights to why we think this is the case. Why would WGU alumni be more likely to be engaged? And some of those insights come from this, that they are more likely to feel that the work they're doing is completely related to what they studied. The alignment between what they went back to college for and the kind of work they're doing. So you can see that nearly 3/4 of WGU graduates currently are in jobs where they say it's completely related to what they studied at WGU. Look at these comparisons, almost twice as likely for WGU graduates to strongly agree to that compared to graduates from all these other categories. You see the non-traditional age graduates here are slightly higher than some of the graduates if you just look at overall national or if you look at public or private nonprofit. And interestingly enough, even within the WGU data, so not every single graduate from WGU says they're in work that's completely related, but look at the difference between those who say it was and on the other end of the scale that it wasn't. 47% of those who say it was completely related are engaged in their work, and about half as many, 21%, are engaged at work if they say that what they studied was not related to what they're doing. So this relevance of what's being studied and what you're doing later in work is a really important factor that I think a lot of institutions need to look at carefully. So one of the other things we measure in this is just not how they're doing in their jobs, but one of the things we're interested in is how are they doing in their overall lives. Gallup studies well-being all over the world. We do it daily in the United States. And these are things that we've been able to validate. If we say somebody's thriving in their well-being, there's a specific way that we calculate this based on questions of how you rate and evaluate your life. But what's important is that we've been able to show that well-being, for example, is a predictor of things like lower healthcare cost burden, right? A number of kind of key validators or key performance indicators that we've been able to show relationships between well-being and other things that matter. And so well-being is not just a nice to have, it's a pretty critical metric. So when we look at the degree to which WGU graduates are engaged in their work and then thriving in their well-being, we break up well-being into 5 different elements of well-being. Purpose well-being, which is effectively liking what you do each day, right? Social well-being, financial, community, and physical well-being. And these are, for example, financial well-being is not necessarily how much money you make, it's more about your relationship to money in your life. So an interesting little tidbit for those of you who might want to improve your financial well-being, people who spend money on experiences have higher well-being than people who spend money on things. And if you think about that for a little bit, it makes a lot of sense. You have the anticipation of the experience. You usually share that experience with other people. You then have the memory of the event or the trip that you took. So there are really important insights in here. But anyway, the long story short is that WGU graduates outpace all the comparison groups on every single element of well-being. And you can see they're particularly high on purpose well-being and financial well-being. One of the things that we know about WGU, that WGU has been written up about a lot, is that it's a very affordable institution. In fact, and I think I'm right about this, Scott, they've increased tuition once in a decade. Is that right? So, and average cost right now is hovering at $3,500 per 6-month term. And so when you think about this, right, obviously financial well-being does have a relationship, and we've seen it in other national research we've done with, for example, high amounts of student loan debt. So here's a study from our national alumni outcome data that will give you some sense of this. Graduates who graduate with high amounts of student loan debt, we categorize this as those who had amounts of $40,000 or more in undergraduate student loan debt. It has a negative impact on their financial and physical well-being for 25 years or more. In other words, some of them have already paid off that student loan debt, and it still has a lasting psychological effect on some aspects of their well-being. So the affordability of an institution certainly relates to this, and so does the quality of the kinds of experiences you have. So I'll segue to that in terms of the experiences of WGU students while they're enrolled. This is one of the statistics that I share often when I speak publicly about our research in this nationally, and it's the importance of a student or a graduate saying that they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams while they were in college. This is a very strongly worded statement, right? Mentor is not defined, so we've asked other questions about did you have a professor, whatever. This is a question that's just generally defined in terms of mentor, but the key part of the phrase is one that I want you to think carefully about. Who encouraged me to pursue my goals and dreams. What's interesting is that nationally, if you just look at all college graduates nationally, and this is looking at all ages, right, all years of graduation, only about 2 out of 10 college graduates in the United States strongly agree they had a mentor who encouraged their goals and dreams during college. It's just 2 out of 10. The WGU data is remarkable on this point, and I'm sure Scott will talk more about their model and some of the drivers of these results. But 2/3 of WGU graduates strongly agree they had a mentor who encouraged them to pursue their goals and dreams. There isn't even a close comparison in this. If you look at private nonprofit institutions who get closest to WGU on this metric, only 41% of those graduates strongly agreed. So WGU is a full 25 percentage points ahead of the second place comparison group in this data. And it's certainly one of the things that's most linked to well-being. So if you said, Brandon, what's the top driver of well-being for college graduates? That item in our survey would be this question. I had a mentor who encouraged me to pursue my goals and dreams. Now, we also asked questions about whether or not they thought their degree was worth the cost. This is also a question we've asked in our national research. There's a lot of fascinating findings behind it. But needless to say, a very high percentage of WGU graduates strongly agree their education was worth the cost. It's 72%. What's interesting about this is you almost have to combine the national data, 5s and 4s on these responses, to get to WGU's score in terms of people who give it a 5, strongly agree. So if I look at this data nationally, you'd have to look at those who said strongly agree and agree, add those together, and then you get close to about 72% where WGU's 72% strongly agree their education was worth the cost. Again, the comparisons aren't even close here. We also had a statement about whether they felt that WGU was a perfect place for people like me. That was how the question was worded. Perfect place for people like me. 69% of WGU grads strongly agree. Again, you can see the comparison groups here are about half the percentage across the board. And then one of the final questions that I'll share today, and again, you can see more in the report that's on your desk, 74% would be extremely likely to recommend WGU to other students. And again, you can see the comparison groups here. None of them get to even the 50% marker on that. So those of you who are interested in the methodology, I talked about a little bit. There's more details in the report. You're certainly welcome to dive into it. But the total sample of the WGU grads that were reported in this were about 2,500 grads. Again, recent grads from 2013 to 17. And those comparison groups are apples to apples comparisons on graduates in that same time frame. So what I'm going to do now is invite Scott Pulsipher, who's the president of WGU, to come up and talk a little bit about the WGU model. And then following his presentation, I'll invite our panelists up and we'll begin the discussion from there. So Scott, thanks for being here today and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandon. It's a pleasure to be here, and we are particularly grateful for Gallup hosting this event to talk a little bit about how WGU has approached its focus, if you will, on student success and outcomes. And I just want to give you some background as to our history, our design, what we have particularly focused on, and some of the things that we believe in our design have directly contributed to the outcomes that Brandon has actually highlighted and focused on here. By way of background really quickly, those of you who don't know WGU, we're a relatively young institution. Relatively, I think, is probably an understatement, meaning that we were founded only 21 years ago. It was founded by a group of visionary governors, 19 governors from Western states, who ultimately identified that there was a particular challenge that they had in serving their residents of their respective states. There were many underserved individuals for whom the existing institutions that they had of higher education were not particularly accessible nor designed for their particular needs. And they also recognized that they had growing economies and that a very talented workforce was a key ingredient to continue to support those economic outcomes and the growth that they expected. So these governors of 19 Western states actually formed Western Governors University in 1997. We today have we're nearing 100,000 students. We have designed specifically to address the challenges that exist across 4 particular areas, meaning that today we have 4 colleges that focus on degree areas, both at the bachelor's and master's level in business, in teacher education, in health professions, as well as the technology sector, which is our youngest college, if you will. Today, most people recognize WGU as one of the innovators or the leading developers of what is competency-based education. A design of a program and courses that specifically try to address the development of proficiency in the students that we serve in particular competency areas. And those competencies are intended to align directly with those that are desired and needed in the workforce space. If you think about WGU too, one of the core elements of it is that it was, if you will, designed or conceived by states for states, and that today we operate in each of the 50 states. We are a university that supports students and adults across all those 50 states, For example, I think we're the only institution that will license teachers in each of the 50 states. We do the same across a variety of other areas and licensure programs. This slide itself is intended to give you some background specifically around when we say we're student obsessed or student focused. It touches all aspects of WGU's design. The graphic itself is intended to say that we put at the center of everything that we do the student. And we think about all aspects of what that student really ultimately needs and how we design everything that we do. We think in particular there are 4 key value proposition areas that have led to that design. First and foremost, the quality and relevancy of the degree program that they're pursuing. As Brandon mentioned, one of the core value propositions of higher education is that it is a path to opportunity. And if you look at the data out there and the research done on this, is that one of the key issues that exists today is the gap between employers' perceptions of the readiness of graduates and the perception of those providing the education and their readiness of their graduates. We're talking about 30 to 40 percentage points different between the institutions who are graduating these individuals and the belief that they have readied them for success in the workforce versus those who are hiring them, who have about 35 to 40 percentage points lower assessment of the graduate's readiness to be successful. So that's about quality and relevancy of the program offering that we have. The second key area that we think about in the value proposition for students is the experience itself. How do you approach learning? How do you design learning? How do you design the overall support and the co-curricular services that are needed to support a student in their learning journey to the outcome? The outcome, first and foremost, being the attainment of a degree. So we very much think about that student experience in all aspects of it. The other and the third key part is we do think about the cost. The ROI matters a lot to us in our design, and because we think it is the fundamental consideration that a student has when approaching higher education. Is there going to be a return on the investment that I'm expected to make? And so we very much focus on the low-cost nature of how we deliver what we deliver. We know that if we make it highly affordable with a high-quality, relevant degree outcome, that we're going to have a great ROI for our students, and you see that evidence in some of the research that Gallup has done of our graduates. And the fourth key area that we think about is ultimately, is this a path to opportunity? If you consider how we obsess about student success, we really think about 2 key outcomes: the attainment of the degree, and does that lead to the attainment of opportunity? We believe that to some degree the most vibrant citizens that we can have, citizens in the broad term mean a very contributing member of society as a whole, that if you think about the vibrancy of those individuals that are most active in their communities and their families and the society as a whole, we think they have to have a degree of self-reliance, of independence, of the opportunity to feel like they are serving a purpose at their place of work or the area of employment that they're pursuing, and that without that, it's very hard to have an active citizen, if you will. And so we do believe fundamentally that the opportunity has to be an outcome associated with the investment in higher education. So from a design standpoint, this is intended to give you a couple key elements, and we'll focus on 1 or 2 of those. First and foremost, we design all of our programs. You noted on the prior slide that we have only about 60 programs. We design all of those programs at a program level. We do not deliver individual courses. When a student attends WGU, they have to enroll in a program from the start. That allows us to design all of the support model around the pursuit of that program for an individual student. The other thing that you note is that all of the competencies that are expected as an outcome for a student attaining that degree program are directly aligned with that which is going to be needed in the workforce in the pursuit of opportunity that they have. We invest every effort to ensure that we are keeping those competencies consistently up to speed, up to date, if not forward-thinking in particular areas. The second thing is that we are fundamentally a teaching institution. There are great research institutions out there, and that may be part of their purpose. Our purpose is ultimately to help students achieve their degree. As such, we've designed all of the faculty model around a teaching approach to that. You'll see that we have specialized faculty roles. I'll give a little more detail around that. But one of the key elements is that it's not just about teaching at course level, but it's teaching at an integrated level at the program. And we have designed to support that mentorship need that exists for these students. The last thing I'll note, and it's probably more appropriately called, we are technology-enabled and a data-driven approach. And that's partly why we, not partly, but it's definitely one of the key reasons why we have partnered with Gallup and other third parties to validate whether or not the innovations that we're pursuing are driving outcomes that we expect from them. That is true for everything that we do. Being technology enabled across the entire student life cycle allows us to actually measure the impact of all the things that we're trying. And quite frankly, if it doesn't work, then we won't keep doing it. I've often said that innovation that has impact is the only thing that is innovation. Otherwise, it's just a bad idea. And so we do obsess around the data and the evidence that proves whether or not the way we've designed things is actually working. So let me give you a little bit more detail around these faculty models. We actually took the kind of traditional role of a faculty and unbundled it, or disaggregated it, if you will, into 4 key roles. You'll note specifically the first one up there is program faculty. These are those program mentors, or what has often also been referred to as our student mentors. This is that singular faculty individual who is assigned to every single student from the time they start until the time they are completed with WGU. These are individuals who are credentialed in the program and the field of study. These are individuals that typically have 8+ years of experience in the workforce or in industry as well, that can provide all of that integrated, augmented instruction that is needed at the program level, inclusive of how does this ready you for success in the pursuit, in the opportunity that you are pursuing, or in the workforce area that you're pursuing. They can bring to bear all of that experience and that knowledge. The other key thing that they are doing is specifically addressing the whole person. It's not just about the learning, it's also about dealing with all of the life challenges that our students deal with, whether it's time demands, whether it's family demands, whether it's the issues like last year. We had over 11,000 students impacted by the hurricanes, that Irma and Harvey last year. And it is this singular point of contact that every one of our students went to deal with the situations and how they were impacted. These faculty mentors specifically address the whole student and how do we best help them succeed. We then have design faculty that focus in at the course level. These are credentialed faculty that specifically teach and support our students in learning particular courses that are part of their broader program. We separately have independent evaluation faculty, and those evaluation faculty need the independence from the curriculum faculty, which is the last one there, because those who are designing the curriculum design not only the courses and the competencies and the learning resources and the assessments themselves that go into the design of the course, but they are not the same faculty who are evaluating the demonstrated proficiency of the students in those courses and programs. That evaluation faculty then keeps, if you will, the integrity of an overall competency-based design. So curriculum faculty design the overall courses and programs, whereas evaluation faculty evaluate the performance of the students in those respective programs. The net of all of this is that we found that the WGU model works, we recognize that because we're serving adult learners, 71% of which have, are working full-time, the same number roughly is are individuals who have families, and therefore they have time commitments beyond their academic pursuits itself. They also have cost considerations, other things like that, that we recognize for them to be successful in their higher education pursuits, we had to provide a model that gave them the support that they needed in the context that they were in. And that included that disaggregated faculty model. I will say one quick note on the faculty model. We didn't start this way. We actually started in the very conventional way, which is we had one faculty role that supported all aspects of the teaching at a course level, and they did all the curriculum design, and they did all the mentoring, et cetera. And it was nowhere near as effective as what we have seen today, to the point that even just in the last 3 years alone, that we've seen our graduation rates increase by over 15 percentage points. That when we unbundled, if you will, the program level mentoring and augmented instruction and that overall holistic support, it dramatically increased our students' ability to persist. And we know that persistence is the key factor driving attainment overall. The other thing that you can see some of the other key outcomes here is that with the competency-based design, meaning you can go as fast as you are able, there is a minimum pace, but you can go as fast as you're able, that we see our students are completing their bachelor's degree in about 2.5 years. When you consider the overall cost then in that context, our graduate is completing a bachelor's degree in about 2.5 years, $15,000. That, when it comes to the ROI, you'll see in our annual report there that our students are within 4 years of graduation are earning over $21,000 more annually within 4 years of graduation. That is a very high ROI. When you can earn upwards of $500,000 or more in lifetime earnings for a $15,000 investment, that is the ROI that we believe in that should exist in higher education. And then ultimately, you can see in the Gallup reviews here that we've been doing this work with Gallup for many years now, that it does lead to higher engagement of our students and our graduates in their workplace. When they know that they're coming out with the proficiency and the competencies that are necessary for them to be highly engaged at work, and that are also enabling them to be highly effective in that work, then it leads to overall personal fulfillment in a way that we believe higher education was designed to do so. So at this point, we've kind of recognized that we're heading in the right direction, that we believe in the innovation that we're driving. We also believe that you have to prove it. That's part of the partnership here with Gallup, is that we absolutely believe that you have to prove that what we're trying to do works and it has an impact. Otherwise, again, like I said, it's just a bad idea. So that hopefully gives you some history and context for now a conversation that can go from here. So thank you.
Terrific. Well, Scott, thank you. Why don't you head up, and I'll also introduce Goldie Blumenstyk from the Chronicle of Higher Education, Jeff Selingo from the Washington Post, two folks who have probably done more writing about higher education and specifically higher education innovation than anybody knows. So thank you for being here. Please join us.
Assigned seats?
No assigned seating, so wherever you guys would like to sit. So, I'd love to start off with this. When I've talked to people about some of the WG results, or they've talked to me, they're usually surprised, right? Because if they usually just know WGU by a descriptor, right? They'll know that it's an online adult-only university, right? And that's usually the depth of what the average person knows about it. So they're surprised to see some of the high scores on things like mentors who encourage me to pursue my goals and dreams. But then when Scott talks about the model, and you understand a little bit of the model, it doesn't sound as surprising. What I'd love to ask both of you to comment on first, what aspects of what Scott talked about do you think are the real drivers? Where do you see innovation here? Is it on multiple levels? Like, is this a technology story? Is this a student-centered model story? Is this about competency-based education? I'd love to get your thoughts on where you see innovation as it relates to the WGU model.
Well, one of the things that you didn't write about as much, you didn't talk about as much with your survey, but what we've reported on previously at the Chronicle is a lot of the data-driven stuff that they do at WGU. Yep. And that's frankly been, I think they've been one of the leaders in that, in just using data to sort of drive direction and change outcomes. And maybe Scott might want to just talk for a second about that, because I actually have some more questions about the role of the mentorship model and some of this other stuff. But I know that the data thing is unusual, and it makes changes.
Well, let me just modify real quick. So data-driven obviously is a big theme, but data around what? I mean, you've talked a little bit about measuring outcomes. You've talked about maybe optimizing the student experience through that. So what are you aiming that data-driven model at as well?
And then I could come back around and talk about the innovation. Go ahead.
I think it's fair to say that there is an overall ethic at WGU that's centered around data, and that the evidence has to prove the theory, or at least the hypothesis that we have around some innovation or some design of the student experience, or even the approach to the learning resources that we're going to use, meaning the external content that we provide for students, to mentorship model that we're going to offer, whatever it is that there is an ethic that says we have to then gather the data that will provide the evidence whether what we've endeavored to do is actually having an impact we expect. Some of that ethic is specifically identifying all the student outcome measures that you have to track and gather data around to know even whether you have evidence to prove an outcome. So, for example, every other Wednesday, for 90 minutes, we review all student metrics that impact all aspects of a student's journey. And so that data-driven ethic, for example, has forced us to design for all of the gathering capability that you need for all these different aspects of what a student is experiencing that so many traditional institutions have not yet done. So it's how they're interacting with learning resources, the frequency and the quality of the interactions they have with the faculty and mentors, the data around the support conversations that they have, the information about the use of different content, and all these different, everything even from the enrollment and admissions process, all aspects of that, we're just collecting data. And the reason you have to do that is because ultimately that data has to be synthesized into whether or not outcomes are being achieved. Simplest outcomes I can point to are things like, are you completing the right number of courses at the right pace to maintain on-time progress? We know that that as a key outcome is a predictor of your likelihood of persisting, meaning retention is then a big key factor. Simply, for example, we know that for every 1/10 of a percentage point change in monthly retention will result in 3 percentage points increase or decrease in graduation rate, for example. We also obsess around things like student satisfaction, not just on overall, but their experience with an evaluator, their experience with the learning resource, all these other things that we gather data on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you, because you can quantify interactions with a mentor, but you can't really quantify. Do you also quantify quality of that interaction? Because it's easy to log in the hours.
We do. We have quality measures around everything from even our assessment design. So we have overall assessment quality index that has 4 different inputs into it around reliability and differentiation, all these other things that we focus on. But yeah, you can also measure quality not just at a macro level, but on specific interactions. Some of that, by the way, came from even simple experiences like rate this page kind of work that's being done in consumer kind of retail online experiences, like this specific experience. How would you rate it? How would you improve it, et cetera? That we take all that data down to a highly granular level. So then we have all these elements that then we can synthesize into outcome measures that allow us to prove whether or not something happens. We have I've at least used this very simple definition of what we identify as ultimate success, which is a happy, credible, employed graduate. This idea that it's not enough to be a graduate, we also want to know that you had a really great experience becoming a graduate. We also want to know that you're credible, meaning does that credential that you've attained, does it have relevancy and high regard by the employers, et cetera. So those things that we then try to endeavor to prove all aspects of it. Now, lastly, I'll say is we have the benefit of having been designed in the age of technology, meaning all aspects of the student journey have technology as an underpinning. Many of traditional institutions don't yet have that. I mean, if you think of all the classroom activity that occurs, so little of it has started to be able to utilize technology to start measuring what's happening in the classroom.
They're retrofitting it back.
That's exactly right. So,
Brendan, I'm not sure you can isolate one thing, but the piece of the WG model that kind of fascinates me in terms of innovative models is the disaggregated model of the faculty in terms of how it might contribute to student success. I first became interested in this model when I wrote my first book 5 years ago, and I talk a lot about it in College Unbound as a potential solution, by the way, to grade inflation at traditional universities, because you're separating kind of the assessment from the teaching and the mentoring. But more so in the last couple of years, and really looking at, for my second book, There Was Life After College, and really looking at how people move into the job market and that mentorship that you talked about in the Gallup work that's so important. Most traditional faculty members at most traditional universities, to be perfectly blunt, some are great teachers and terrible mentors and terrible researchers. Some are great researchers but terrible teachers and terrible mentors, right? It's very hard to find, in some ways they're unicorns, right, who can do it all and are really good at it and have time to do it all. I just finished a paper that hasn't been published yet on the future of faculty spaces. We have this traditional faculty office in higher education, and mostly, especially first-generation students, they're kind of intimidated. I know when I was a reporter at the Chronicle, I was intimidated walking down this hallway of long hallway of offices. Go to any traditional college or university, most of the time the doors are closed. You're never quite sure the faculty member is there. I mean, we don't do a very good job in higher education of helping students not only find faculty members, but find the time for faculty members where they could be mentored. Mm-hmm. So I like this idea of the disaggregated model. I'm not quite sure that's the only thing that leads to these outcomes, but comparing it to what I see in traditional higher ed, it might have some effect in my mind.
What else? So you've mentioned data-driven, right? You've jumped on the disaggregated faculty thing. What are the other things that jump out to you? as you think about this? So you had some other thoughts and questions too, Goldie.
Yeah, I guess I still have this question, frankly, about the role of not the mentor faculty member, but the other faculty member, the course faculty member. How much interaction, honestly, does the student get with that faculty member? Just because, or is it really all vested only in this mentor person?
No, it's not. I mean, where you will see greater variability is the student's interaction with that course faculty member. The reason being is that in a competency-based design, each individual student comes with already a different level of competency in a particular course level. So, for example, take someone who's enrolled in an accounting program. That individual may have already had many years of actual accounting work. Right. And so there are certain base level courses that they don't need a lot of interaction with a course level faculty subject matter expert, that they can they can move through that course pretty regularly and pretty efficiently. Whereas another student who doesn't have that background, they're going to have a high degree of engagement. So it's definitely one of those faculty members that the degree of need will vary by individual student, and all that engagement is going to be as much or as little as necessary for that particular student. One general thing that we've measured and have evidence of is that the faculty mentor, not the course faculty member, but that program mentor, that is an individual who is often actually directing students to have more engagement with course faculty, because they're recognizing that, listen, you're really struggling, you're not ready for these assessments yet, you need specifically targeted engagement with the course faculty for this area of this course, etc. I'm going to see you make sure that you have this regular interaction with them until you're ready so that we can schedule your assessment. So if you will, the program mentor is still kind of governing and proactively engaging the course faculty with the student based upon their mentor relationship with that student. The program mentor typically will also assess when an individual is ready for their assessment to take in the first place, not the course faculty mentor. The course faculty member will identify all the teaching that needs to happen, but ultimately the readiness is being assessed primarily by the mentor. So.
It's interesting. Two of the things that jumped out to me were around what I would call very seriously and intentionally student-focused, right? You could even say customer-obsessed if you wanted to use a word that's not real popular in higher ed, but that is broadly understood elsewhere. And the other piece of it is it's directly work-aligned. I mean, there are not 100 different programs. There are 60, and they are aligned to high-demand jobs, right? So there was very intentional design around that work-aligned program, and there really aren't a lot of choices. Like to your point, you choose a path, and that's the path you go down. So there's not a lot of distracting options of other courses you could take that are kind of non-core. Yeah. And so, to what degree are those things? I'm curious.
Well, Brendan, I'm wondering. I'm curious to how, given the high outcomes in the Gallup work with WGU, how much of that design results in the thing, right?
Compared to this is a self-selected population, right?
Well, and it's also not only a self-selected population, but it's people who are very intentional about their careers, unlike most students who go into higher ed who kind of don't know what they want to necessarily do. But it's also kind of limited in your choices as well. Right, so how much of that then results in, more happiness and higher outcomes afterwards?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So
I know you're comparing them to the non-traditional.
Yeah,
but that's.
So I think that's.
I don't even know if that's necessarily. That may be a good comparison on being career focused.
Yeah.
But even at most places, non-traditional students also have a lot of choices in terms of majors and
right, yeah. So I think there's institutional level attributes, right, where you say most institutions strive to offer more and more programs, not fewer, right, because that's kind of part of the prestige of being better is you offer more programs, you're more comprehensive, you give more choice. But I tell you, in the data at least, what I was surprised by is that the other non-traditional graduates weren't higher on their work alignment. Now, great that WG was higher, but it was significantly higher. So I would have said, yeah, if you're just looking at traditional age college graduates, from a comprehensive university or a private liberal arts university or whatever it might be, there's many reasons why they're going to college beyond just to get a good job, right? And so you say, okay, did they align with? They learned, and they learned to be lifelong learners, and there's a lot of other things you can dig at there. It's interesting, though, because what one of the reports we put out 2 weeks ago was Strata Education. We did a big report. This is of all graduates from all levels. So this includes associate degree, bachelor degree up. Anyway, it was a report about relevance and the degree to which people found relevance in their work. And it was cued off of by two very basic questions. The degree to which you felt the courses you took are directly related to the work you do. So that was a work-related relevance question. And the second one was about their day-to-day life. So the things I learned in college are directly related to, my day-to-day life. And so because we were trying to get at the relevance to work and the relevance to other things beyond work. Well, the long story short is that only 26% of graduates in the United States strongly agreed to both of those. And it was, a little higher if you look at them individually. But here was the big point. They're relevant. So if they strongly agreed to either of those questions, the likelihood that they said that their education was worth the cost and that they had a high quality education was just orders of magnitude higher than any objective measure of quality we've measured. So we looked at graduation rates of the institution. Relevance was a much stronger predictor of your feelings that it was worth the cost and high quality. We looked at the average SAT and ACT scores of the students enrolled there. Relevance was a much higher predictor. We looked at average student loan debt. Relevance was a much higher predictor, right? So it's an interesting story so here's my question, right? I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think WGU model is very work-aligned. But I think students finding relevance in their education is not mutually exclusive to things like a liberal education or a university that offers a comprehensive set of programs. I think it gets down to making sure, right, that all of those different things that there's some relevant application, right, where you can see that application. Because ironically, you'd think liberal arts graduates are the highest in saying that they learned something that they could apply in their day-to-day life, right? Because it's a universal education. It broadly prepares you for a number of things. They aren't, but they should be. Right, and so I kind of challenge the idea that work-aligned programs is the only way to increase relevance for people. So I don't know. What do you think?
I still kind of want to. I guess I want to then go back to this notion of: is there some element of self-selection in the WGU student because they're choosing this very different model? Because I've just done some reporting on the adult students as well. Most of them are going back to school for specific purpose. They are very purpose-driven in their approach. So I would have expected there to be I would have expected some of their findings to come out higher as well compared to WGU. They didn't. So it just kind of brings me back to a little bit of have you ever polled students about why they chose WGU versus something else? Because you're choosing a different model, a competency-based, low cost maybe. I should have pointed out cost is probably a distinguishing factor. But there's got to be some element of self-selection here that matters.
I think so. I think we have not taken a particular study to understand exactly why they're pursuing their degree with WGU.
Not someone else.
Yeah, versus not someone else. Meaning to isolate the reasons that they come to WGU enough to understand it just broadly is why are you pursuing your degree in the first place? We have actually done a fair amount of research to identify among 40 different kind of variables. Some that are purely on the cognitive dimension, others that are on more the grit dimension. The purpose for pursuing an education ranks really high on the grit dimension, which is if you have a reason for pursuing your degree in your education in the first place, you're going to rank a lot higher on your purpose. I don't see any of our data in our research of our own students who are enrolling at WGU to see them higher on that factor than students at other institutions like us. I mean, they're primarily serving older adult learners, right, or even traditional institutions serving the 18 to 24-year-old population. I think they all come in with a reasonable purpose, which is this 56 or 58% of them or whatever saying, I'm pursuing it as a path to a job, an opportunity. I think that we do not have any definitive data that says our students are notably different than students at other institutions, that they're self-selecting into WGU. I think that there is surely a factor as they're coming in now that we know that more than 50% of our newly enrolled students last year came from referrals, which is up markedly just in the last 2 years. And it's probably a function of the fact that we have over 105,000 alumni now. We have 450 community college partnerships and articulation agreements. We have a large set of employers that are partners that many are realizing that these individuals had a great return, as some of the Gallup data shows, and is that when they have that great return, they definitely refer more. So there may be some already perceiving at the start that says, this is going to be something that's right for me, and then therefore they have that selection bias.
But it's likely if WGU didn't exist, they would go somewhere else.
They would go
right?
somewhere else. I don't think there's any evidence to say that we've expanded the total number of individuals pursuing higher
or that
education.
your students are so much different than except on the outcomes, right? So
generally than the other adult learners.
Than the other
which
adult
is
learners,
still
right?
40% of the population that are choosing community colleges typically, or other online universities, et cetera, that our student population is notably different than those. 40 or so percent of them are first-time college graduates. 70% of them are working, 70% have family. I think you'll see a very similar profile in that.
So then it does suggest something about the model that is producing these outcomes.
But the question is it online? Is it competency-based? Is it mentor?
And I think that's how do you disaggregate what part of the model
do you think it's hard? Are you getting the spillover of people who might have previously gone to a University of Phoenix, or now that some of that sector has seen its enrollment?
We don't have any actual data to know that had you pursued another. We do know that they were considering other options before, that those options aren't as readily not available. What's the right term? That they're not
as desirable in the market.
They're not as desirable as they were previously. But we think that mood may even shift too. I think that anyway. So back to the broader point is, I don't think we have any evidence to say we've expanded the pie by making WGU as an option, competency-based online as an option overall. The total number of individuals, of adult learners in particular, are now pursuing versus what was pursuing before. We think that it's mostly been a share shift, if you will, market share shift. But
I'm going to do this. I know we got plenty of questions that we can keep batting around here in our conversation. Let me turn to the audience and see if there's a couple quick questions.
Can I ask you a quick question first before we do that?
Yeah.
One of the things where WGU really spiked a lot on this was the alumni affection thing. I mean, it was like double what any other kind of college reported. Are there other things that you've done in your polling that also sort of generate this strong alumni affection?
Yeah, so when you think about it, I mean, you could call it a number of things, right? Alumni affection, we've referred to it in some of our Gallup Purdue Index reports as, alumni attachment, right? I mean, so, we're looking at things where we're asking questions about, I would recommend it to others like me, right? It was the perfect place for people like me. One of my favorite ones that we've measured as part of our national stuff is, I can't imagine a world without,
so
insert the name of the institution, right? And so if you just said, what's the best question, Gallup, that you could ask about somebody, feeling really great about their experience with anything? I mean, you think about how you say that about Starbucks, or, think of your favorite brand, right? I can't imagine a world without, insert the name of your favorite brand. You go, I couldn't. Yeah. So to think about that about your university experience. And, and interestingly enough, the national data on those ratings are pretty low. So in our national Gallup Purdue Index data set, the very first year we reported that alumni attachment metric, only about 2 out of 10 were what we would call strongly emotionally attached clients, in the same way that, for example, a Ritz-Carlton would measure it, where, and this has been published in certain places, Ritz-Carlton had metrics over 50%. And so anyway, I mean, the drivers of it, though, Goldie, are, if you say, okay, go back to the things that are the biggest drivers, they are questions like the professors at my alma mater cared about me as a person. There are things like, I had a mentor who encouraged me to pursue my goals and dreams. They're also about some of the experiential aspects of college, right? Things like, I had a job or an internship where I applied what I was learning in the classroom. So that gets at that relevance point a little bit. But I mean, if I were to just briefly summarize those key drivers, I would say it was they had a relationship-rich and work-integrated / experiential experience. And it plays out in alumni giving. And so you say, okay, in the studies we've done on alumni giving later, the top item that correlates with alumni giving is professors cared about me as a person, which is interesting. It's actually slightly higher than the mentor question, although the mentor question is a more strongly worded one. But I think what we're seeing there is it didn't just happen with one person. There were more than one people, right? More than one person made that a good experience for you. And so, you ask the question, to what degree have universities really paid attention to, from a data-driven perspective, that element of care? I mean, first of all, it's fluffy.
Right.
Oh, you're going to measure care, Gallup, and you're going to measure well-being, and but yeah, the news flash is we have a couple Nobel laureates who have won prizes in economics for their work and well-being.
But it seems that, Brandon, from these findings,
matter.
though, that we've always thought in traditional higher ed that you had the residential experience then mattered, or the face-to-face experience mattered for the relationship part of that then would lead to more alumni giving. And also, by the way, not only the residential experience, but all the co-curricular, extracurricular stuff, including athletics. But it shows here then that you don't necessarily need that the relevancy and the mentorship can be applied beyond that residential or face-to-face experience.
Yeah, I think so. And
can you raise money off of that? That's
and that, put a fine point on it. The residential models can do it, but if your assumption is that because you're residential, this is magically happening, I think is the biggest mistake I see. Is I hear leaders who will say to me, "Oh, we're doing great on these metrics," and I go, "Well, why do you feel that way?" And they'll say something like, "Because we're a small, private, residential," and I go, "Wait, if those are the reasons why you think you're doing well, there isn't a lot of data to substantiate that. If you show me an intentional, value-driven..."
The opposite's just true too. Just because it's online doesn't mean it's not on the other side. It's intentional.
That's exactly right.
What the key word there is, it either has to be intentional, residential, and face-to-face, or it has to be intentional in the model that you've designed.
Right, which I think is also, even in the residential stuff or campus-based institutions, I don't think they can actually filter out the self-selection bias either that exists in the students that make up their populations no more than we can. And so they just try to compare themselves to each other, and they make mistaken conclusions that is a huge contributing factor as to the richness of the experience.
Which is why they spend so much money on it, right?
Yeah, and and I was even jokingly saying, is like, hey, you can do all this without an athletics, or for that matter, a football team is really what matters. You're like, you don't need a football team. I know that football teams actually contribute significantly to alumni giving. I mean, that's a lot of the attachment that exists. However, that doesn't factor heavily into the ROI calculation that graduates are doing on whether this was worth the cost, because they're still left with, it costs me, what is it, $80,000 for a 4-year degree at a public university currently. Like, they're still trying to figure out, like, all right, if all I got was how I feel about my football team when they play on Saturday, that's not going to cut it. We ultimately think it has to be path to opportunity. If they have that return, then we know that they're going to have a high affinity for the university.
And I'm actually not joking. Do you do alumni fundraising?
We just have only really begun kind of an effort to increase our alumni giving. That we recognize that with 105,000 individuals who have a high affinity for the university, that there's a way for them to give back and make it possible for more individuals to pursue their degree, especially individuals like them that were looking for that catalyst to change their life, and we were part of that.
I know from my other reporting, there's just not a lot of philanthropy around adult students right now, and there needs to, it's a big gap in the market.
Yeah. All right, so we've got a couple questions. We'll go in the back first, and then we'll come up front to you, sir. Yeah.
Hi there. I'm Alan Gross from the Washington Center for Internships and Academic Seminars. I want to press Brandon's question about the relevance and the relationship between experience and study. We did with Gallup a similar study of our alumni. They're much more traditionally aged, but we saw on the data point about workplace engagement a very similar bump where this experience seems to edge out. Jeff Selingo, you wrote about in your last book about the sprinters and the wanderers and the stragglers. Is this phenomenon really sort of identifying something different about the relationship of education and the economy and life today? You wrote a little bit about the phenomenon of emerging adulthood, right? Do we just need to broaden the Western governors model nationally? Do we need another book, There Is College After Some Life?
So what you're saying is that this sometimes just is a function of, so is the question, is this just the function of kind of maturity and age?
Maturity and age, but also kind of shifts in society and the relationship between different experiences and education and the nature of the economy with so many, you'll go through so many jobs before you're done, right? What fixes the relevance, right, of that connection between experience and college? Right? Are we in a
probably going to be a different educational? I mean, I think a lot of people have been writing about this, this 40-year education model as opposed to the 4-year education model. I think we are definitely going to be moving ourselves into some version of more lifelong learning model, with people kind of getting the opportunity to kind of come back and retool every few years or something. I don't think colleges have begun to understand what that looks like for their financial planning, but
well, and I think the relevancy depends on where you are in your career, in your life. In some ways, after talking about how good the disaggregated model is, in some ways the rebundled model at traditional universities is necessary, I think, because you need to. I think there's too many silos at a traditional university, not among how the teaching and research and mentorship works, but among kind of the inside the classroom experience and outside the classroom experience, right? And students don't know how to translate the knowledge learned in one place to another venue. That comes with time and maturity. I think that's something that older students do much better at. We're much better at translating our experiences, our knowledge learned in one venue to another venue. It's much more difficult for 18 to 22-year-olds. So I think that's why that model works for WGU. I'm not quite sure that model would necessarily work, for a traditional 18 to 22-year-old.
Well, just this relevance thing is very important. When I was reporting recently on the adult students, I kept hearing about this notion of andragogy, and I didn't buy it. It's this at first. I said, well, what does that mean? Isn't that just good teaching adults versus teaching younger people? And I became persuaded by all the people who know a lot more than I do about this in the field that there is a difference in how you teach. Then a lot about andragogy is about relevance. You can teach. You just have to find a different context when you're teaching to adult students. You teach the same thing, but you teach it with a different context.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think to your particular question, two thoughts come to mind. One is that the design of, if you will, the theory, if you kind of break down education into general contexts, theory and practice, that even the design at WGU about the theory part of it it's made up by the competences that we see as directly relevant to the jobs that they're going to be doing, versus the research-based theories that are going on. So example I even bring about from prior experience to WGU was as I was working on a marketing advisory board and a guest lecturer, et cetera, at BYU in teaching and marketing. There were a lot of marketing theorists that were the academicians there that were trying to teach what I would call the theory of digital marketing, where I was like, actually, marketing today is digital. It's not a new theory. It's just how do you apply marketing in practice today? I'm like, and my approach to teaching what I was teaching was all about what is the practice of marketing today in the context of business today and what we were doing there. And so the design of the theory itself, because we're competency-based, is to align that more with what we expect in practice. Now, in practice, too, one thing that there is a misconception, if you will, about WGU, because we're entirely online, is that experiential learning, therefore, is not part of the education, when in fact that's not at all true, especially in our licensure programs where the clinical work is part of the design of the program itself. And we also have those that are assessors of the demonstration of the theory that they've learned in the course and the faculty engagement in the actual clinical rotations they have, whether it's demonstration teaching, whether it's nursing rotations, et cetera. That is also being assessed. And so we have those that are assessing how well are those individuals applying the theory in practice. It's working so much that, in fact, we're trying to figure out how to bring that experiential learning into the design of our other programs. So apprenticeship in technologies, in our technology programs, apprenticeship in the business programs, however you want to call them, but the idea is experiential learning is a huge factor in closing the gap that exists between actual graduates' capability and what is needed in the workforce. That gap needs to be significantly narrowed so that when they're coming out, they become very applicable, versus hey, we've taught you all this, now go forth and conquer and enter your second phase of education, which is all employer-driven in the job you're doing. We're like, yeah, how about we just bring those two closer together? I think, that, by the way, our own approach to, if we were to design and deliver liberal arts programs, we would take that same approach, that in the pursuit of a liberal arts degree, you still need to actually have the readiness and certain competencies for the workforce, such that you can have much higher outcomes for those pursuing those degrees also into workforce transition, that you can scale up significantly their readiness in a way that's not done today. So
I'll go to the gentleman here in the front row. You had a question? Yes.
I'm Joe Javra. I'm the president of LAU. I love the study. I think it's quite innovative in its approach. But let me take the conversation a little bit higher. As we all know, we live through the fourth industrial revolution, which is really characterized by so many technological, if you will, innovations, from really nanotechnology to artificial intelligence to you name it, the Internet of Things, of the things. And given the fact that there are predictions, whether they're true or not remains to be seen, that at the latest by 2050, half of the current jobs that exist in the world will dissipate, will disappear. That's something that we need really to cope with. Now, in terms of what universities in general are doing, and in terms of what your university is doing, what are we doing with respect to two things? First, there is no question about it that our graduates must become well-versed in what's going on in the world, technologically speaking. I'm talking about the skills that they have. The challenge is, how can we really provide the opportunity for those students to gain those skills, but at the same time, avoid graduating automatons? That is, continue to graduate really educated people. And secondly, in light of that revolution that is taking place, how are we really addressing the content of our curriculum? And secondly, the mode of delivery in light of what's going on in the world. Mm-hmm. So if you really would elaborate a little bit about these things, how universities in general are really approaching these issues, and in particular, how your university is.
Or how should we, where should we start?
This is probably one of the greatest challenges I think education is facing. Is how to respond to the future of work, where skills and knowledge is churning at an ever faster rate, and where half of the jobs might be disappear because of artificial intelligence or automation. So I think there's a couple of things. One is that it is an education system. And that we can't, it's not just higher education that is responsible for this, but I think that really what we need to figure out is, technology has always replaced people, right? That's nothing new. I think that what's new about this is that more education, in the long race between education and technology, education has always won, right? Just get more education and you'll always beat technology. I'm not quite sure that's going to necessarily be true over the next 20 or 30 years. So we have to help students navigate a world, or help people navigate a world where they're going to complement technology rather than always try to compete with it. I don't think that's just the responsibility of higher education. I think it's a responsibility of education writ large. Second, and the final point, and probably the more important point, is that I think we're moving from an era where education is less episodic and much more continual. I wrote a piece for The Atlantic a couple weeks ago about this new revolution, this idea that we don't just go and get a bachelor's degree and then a couple of years later we might go get a master's degree and a couple of years later we might go get a certificate when we need it, but that we're going to kind of continuously be in education mode. In some ways, WGU is traditional in that way, in that it's episodic, just like most other colleges, right? You come in, you enroll, and you get out. And you get that degree. Where their model might be helpful for this new world is the idea of competency-based education, which shrinks the time for most students. And that might enable us to move to a world where you could be continually looping in and looping out of education because you're not going to be defined by the time in a seat. Mm-hmm.
I agree with everything you just said, except for the part at the beginning where you said we're in a system. I mean, there's no system. There's no way to. I mean, but that's important.
A system at a not in a.
No one's in charge, is what I'm saying.
Nobody's in charge, right? Not in that.
There's
way.
There's not one.
We have K through 12. We have higher ed. We have
right.
That's what I mean.
We have an ecosystem, and really, it's not easy to sit here and say this is how it's going to work, because it's going to bubble up. It's going to come from all directions. It's going to come from corporations and employers. It's going to come from a lot of different directions.
No, and the people that are most going to be helped by this system, I think, or this way we're going to be learning in the future, are people who can self-direct their own learning, which we know is a very small part of the population,
right?
And usually is the population that already is well educated to begin with,
right? And the people who need this system the most are going to be the ones who are most deprived by it.
Yeah.
I mean, DIYU is really terrible for a lot of people who didn't go to good high schools or good elementary schools to get them started.
Which is mentorship becomes more important.
Right.
Hi, Lauren Maddox at Holland and Knight. Scott, I have a question for you about cost. How have you been able to keep the cost so low of tuition? I mean, one hike in 10 years is really striking. And also, how transparent is WGU about where those dollars are invested?
To the first question, I think that this is also in our overall operating model, honestly, in our economic model. It is also where student obsession plays a huge factor in it. That we endeavor to ensure that all efficiency gains that we get and everything from the economies of scale that we get in terms of how we manage everything from admissions to enrollment to student support to even our student-faculty ratios, you name it, that all the efficiencies we gain, we do not in any way endeavor to kind of start building a reserve of greater profitability, et cetera. We give back. We give back because if we can gain efficiencies, then we will not change anything in terms of the cost to the student. And that's allowed us to, for nearly 10 years, to not touch tuition. In fact, what's notable during that same time period is that the discounts and scholarships and other things that were being given to students actually reduced the net cost to students over that same time period to where we literally had something on the order of 5% drop in the actual net cost because of the number of individuals who are taking advantage of discounts and employer partnerships, et cetera. That starts again with this notion that we are doing everything we can to be economically viable, but not do so in a way that says we operate at a 10 to 20% operating margin. We operate more in the 2 to 5% operating margin. We truly kind of probably take the not-for-profit literally. That's allowed us to be economically viable, that we have a reserve to support the innovations that we want to drive going forward, et cetera. But we have endeavored to ensure that the low cost is a key value proposition for our students. To the transparency point, as a nonprofit, we have to publish our 990s. It's very evident as to what percentage of our operating budget, which is effectively 100% of our revenue, if you will, what percentage of it is going to academic investment. It tends to be 60 to 62% of our total operating budgets are directly in academics. Easily 70% of our headcount is our full-time faculty. So most of our headcount investments into the faculty that's directly supporting students. You can see what percent is going into our technology. We probably spend a larger portion of our operating budget on technology. We're spending 10 to 12%. We're also, investing 15 to 20% in ongoing kind of enrollment and marketing administration, things like that. But our 990s are published, so everyone can go pull them.
Scott, how much of your cost of acquisition for students, to use the businessy term for all this stuff, I mean, how much of that does that benefit from employer partnerships?
Ultimately what we benefit from is the reputation and the credibility of our graduates, because we're seeing that referral rate that I mentioned earlier. It's going up dramatically, meaning 20 plus percentage points has increased over the last 2 years as the percentage of our new students that have enrolled have come from referrals. So those referrals come in from alumni directly, which have no cost, meaning we have no discounts necessarily for those students. We obviously have employer partnerships that some of them have discounts, but even a declining percent of those we intend to do simply because our tuition's so low. Like giving a 5% discount off their already low tuition, you're like, it's not the same as a 5% discount off of something that's twice as high. And so the referral rate definitely reduces our cost of acquisition. Having said that, I think we're still probably 1/3 of the cost of a new student versus a comparable institutions. I like to say that simply ourselves, we're trying to just simply project or forecast demand, not design for or build a target. We have no target for how large WGU is going to be and how large our enrollment's going to be. No, we're just trying to project what the demand is, what demand's going to be, and ensure that we invest to support that level of student enrollment that we'll have. And it's been notable that even this last year, our enrollment growth has increased or accelerated in pace versus even the last year. So,
we have another question.
Hi, Sean Riley with the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Appreciate WGU's commitment to metrics, but last week I went to a lecture at Catholic University by Jerry Mueller, who just released a book called Tyranny of Metrics, and he also published a article in the Chronicle based on that book. One of the things he says is that not everything that's important is measurable, and not everything that's measurable is important. Okay, so how do you answer those kinds of skeptics? You know, that people that are so people that can be skeptical about so closely tying value to outcome metrics.
Well, I think it's fair to say that I disagree with that perspective. I actually think that if it is important, then it should be measurable. I don't think it's fair to say that if something is important, we're just going to take it purely on faith. And just the example we were talking about earlier, which is this notion that residence-based is in fact the key ingredient. Like, if that's true, then you should be able to measure that impact. And there may be imperfect measures of it, but there should still be ways to measure it. The reason I say there's imperfect measures, surveys by themselves are imperfect versus something that's actual and observed activity or a transactive thing that you can observe, that those are imperfect because it's very hard to remove selection bias and other things like that. Having said that, even an imperfect measure over time, the trend is meaningful. And so I think that to quote what I learned at Amazon too, is it was often understood that if you can know, you should know. And so if you want to make an argument that this innovation, whether it's our disaggregated faculty model, or we want to even measure the impact of this learning resource content versus that learning resource content on student outcomes, then you should be able to gather the data to measure that and do so in an A/B true kind of randomized controlled trial that allows you to isolate the impact of a change that you're making on a student outcome measure. So I would say that generally, if it is important, then you should be able to measure the relative importance of that. And the more you do, I think then we're making more informed decisions. Another example I would give too is just around data and information. We started a program called the Responsible Borrowing Initiative over 4 years ago now, where we simply endeavored to give individuals more information about the actual cost of student loans, and that with better information that they were likely to make better decisions, which is they reduced their reliance on loans. So we already have a very low-cost model, but we ourselves had students that were graduating at the time with over $20,000 in debt per graduate, and we're like, that's too much for our program. So we gave them better information, and in not more than 3 years' time, annual borrowing reduced by 41%, such that overall borrowing per graduate now has dropped by nearly $5,000 over 4 years, to where our own students are graduating with $5,000 less debt than they were 4 years ago, simply because we can provide them better data and information about a choice like that. So we do think data and metrics better inform decision making.
Well, I would just say one of my favorite conversations that I have with higher ed leaders is about talk about measuring the things you value. So we did an analysis, Gallup did, of the most commonly used words and phrases in college mission statements. And so we ingested, I know it sounds like a really fun exercise to do. We ingested about 1,000 college mission statements. And if you do a little word cloud analysis on that, the interesting thing is that the most commonly used phrase that bubbles up is lifelong learning. And so first of all, this is the most commonly used phrase in college mission statements. And then, my follow-on to that, when everybody goes, oh, how interesting, is I say, how are you measuring that? And so if you don't really believe in it, then don't put it in your mission statement. If you do believe in it, and you can measure that, or at least attempt to measure that, then you should. And so, the honest reaction to a lot of higher ed leaders when I ask, how are you measuring that, is they don't have an answer, right? They haven't even thought about challenging themselves to measure that. And I'm not suggesting there's a perfect way to measure lifelong learning. I'll give you a simple example of a question we use in our well-being data. And it's a statement about, I learn or do something interesting each day. It turns out if you strongly agree to that, think of how each of you would answer that question. You have, statistically speaking, higher well-being than people who say, yeah, no, not really. It turns out, though, that there's no difference in the likelihood of strongly agreeing to that question by education level, except if you've gotten to a postgraduate level. And there, I might argue, selection bias. We're sorting on people who are truly, naturally interested learners. I don't know, I'm just, reading into that a little bit. But the point is There's ways that we could measure this from an activity perspective, from a, just a statement about whether or not you feel like you're able to do those things. So I think that's a challenge to higher ed. It's not, in addition to measuring data that's very knowable, it's actually relatively easy to measure. There's still a lot of missing pieces on that. Think about the kind of data that Georgia State has used to, put educational attainment on par between underrepresented minorities and white students. They literally are on par now. And that has been a data-driven initiative on student record information data. So we're not even talking about, something like measuring lifelong learning. But I do think it's a challenge to all of higher ed to think about, are we measuring all the things that really matter? Are we measuring the things we value? And if we aren't, can we at least make an attempt? I mean, I think an attempt is still better than, just saying, well, of course we produce lifelong learners. So anyhow, do we have one more question in the audience, and then we'll let the panel make some wrapping up comments? Yeah.
Good morning, Brian Jackson from STEM Connector. Thanks so much for your guys' comments today. It's been pretty enlightening. My question has to do on a part of the ecosystem that we've mentioned a little bit today, but I think can kind of be left out of this conversation is, if I were an employer, if I were a large corporation, let's say Fortune 500, if you will, what is a recommendation or an action that can come out of this research that I can use to better my workforce, or to look in a different place, et cetera? What would you tell me if I were to say the CHRO of a Fortune 500 because of this research? What can I do differently? Thanks.
Well, one of the things is how companies recruit from colleges and universities. For a lot of employers, they don't really know kind of why their best employees survive and thrive, end up staying there and end up thriving over time. And when they do that research and they reverse engineer the careers of those people, they find that some of those people didn't come through their normal recruiting channels, for example. So I think a lot of this is I think that we tend to be biased. I think some large companies tend to be biased about where they recruit, the types of institutions they recruit. I think they tend to hew closely to other national rankings, and they're not necessarily looking at not only their own outcomes, meaning who are the employees that end up doing best here, and how did they get here, and where did they come from, but looking at measures like mentorship and experiential learning and all these other measures that are not well measured, I don't think, by most of the other national rankings out there. So to me, it's most large companies, I think, depend on kind of old style of recruiting. They have their list of institutions that they normally recruit at, and are not necessarily looking at measures like this.
And I would take it from the other side, on the tuition benefit side. I mean, I don't know that I would sit here and argue that tuition benefit should be limited to specific colleges. Companies, I like the idea that companies are keeping it a little bit more open, but if companies can identify places that are better, that they think are better, maybe they can incentivize employees to use those colleges over others, or at least maybe streamline that process. The biggest challenge I heard about for adult students was the tuition benefit doesn't, they have to pay the money up front. It's obviously not as big an issue at WGU, where the cost isn't that great, but if maybe you could even incentivize by paying the tuition up front at the schools that you've identified as having the best practices along the way, and that way the students are not out of pocket on some of these.
If I may add just to that point, maybe tying into this gentleman's question earlier on, which is, I think it would be purposeful if an employer in fact provided greater incentive for certain educational outcomes that they wanted, versus just, hey, we'll pay for anything. And the reason I bring this up is it's notable at Amazon. They have a great tuition benefit program for a lot of their fulfillment center workers and call center workers, et cetera. But this was true 2 years ago, that the number one thing that they used that tuition benefit for was truck driving. And this is go back to that's probably not the primary thing that they want to be funding in the long-term perspective of 20 years from now. Probably not the highest demand, and yet
it's the current demand, right?
Yeah, but it's the current demand for them in particular, but it was also one that they perceived guess what, it wasn't solving, which is what the real thing they need, which is they need more programmers and computer scientists. And hey, may we give a differential incentive for those to pursue the kind of jobs, or the stackable credential certificates that says, how do we get those that are in those current more manual labor jobs into more of the thinking, coding jobs? Like, maybe you give a differential incentive to some of those things. The other thing I would offer to your question is, I think few employers have really endeavored to identify the exact competencies that they actually need in their workforce. Mm-hmm. So they don't hire against that competency. What they end up having is highly subjective interviewing process with degree inflation that Jeff referenced earlier, which is, I've decided this job needs a degree, when 2/3 or 3/4 of the individuals currently in the job don't have a degree, but now they say, all right, the first imperfect filter is we're going to go look for someone who has a degree. Like, that's actually not what you should be interviewing or recruiting on the basis of. You should probably first identify all the competencies that are necessary for success of your the individuals that you're recruiting to your institution. If you want highly engaged employees, I would say definitely at the high end of the list of competencies would be, how well are you a fit for the organization's culture and purpose and mission, their leadership principles, et cetera, to ensure that first and foremost that individual's own personal purpose is going to be well aligned with your organizational purpose. There's really good data that says most institutions are really ineffective in this. And they leave it to subjective interviewing, which is also incredibly poor in terms of its application of the recruiting by competence, if you will. And I think that's one of the challenges that exist today, is that recruiting practice is generally so variable, even with inside in a single institution, that there needs to be more programmatic approach to it.
Well, I'm excited because my son is 6 and he's learning both truck driving and coding right now.
Perfect.
So I've got these bases covered.
That's right.
So let me do this. Let me ask each of the panelists to maybe wrap up with a parting thought, comment, question, and we've got about 5 minutes left, so that kind of gives you an idea. But Goldie, do you want to start?
Yeah, they're going to take away my reporter's press pass if I don't ask this question, so I'm going to do it right now. Obviously, we've talked a lot about how the WG model seems to emphasize relationship building, but clearly there are people in the federal government at the Office of Inspector General who have questioned whether this education has substantial and regular contact with students, adequate enough for you to be eligible for student financial aid. How do you hope to rectify this? I'm assuming most people are familiar with that the department has come down and challenged the very model of WGU on this grounds.
Yeah, I think the reality is that from our perspective is that we continue to endeavor to innovate on behalf of students. So our intent to how to rectify it is more an answer of like, how are we continuing to innovate to drive the outcomes that ultimately students and employers need for those students? If we think about serving those customers, we're okay with the fact that where thinking may exist in certain sectors of regulators may not be caught up with where education is going and how we deliver innovation on behalf of students. We're okay with that. So we actually think that mostly is that, considering our model, considering how we focus on students, considering the outcomes that we've delivered, and considering the fact that we've long felt that this has always been compliant with the design of how distance education should be delivered around key things, that we think that what we're doing and the continued innovation that we're driving will take care of itself. And so we're not making any particular focused endeavor to try to address this issue head on. We believe that ultimately innovation is going to win. And so the sad thing I will say is that the OIG's review of WGU, the sad thing I think from our perspective is the chilling effect it's had on so many other institutions who've been trying to innovate on behalf of students, that it's caused them all to pause. And they're kind of a little worried about like, oh man, I got to get regulator permission to do this before I can do it. And I'm like, that's an unfortunate outcome, which is you should do the right thing for students and be okay that others are going to have to catch up to that.
Do you feel like there's extra weight on you? You're the big player in this field that you have to sort of make this case for them now?
Yeah.
You're sort of standing up for competency-based education or a mentor model or whatever it is that they're, really the mentor model that they're challenging though.
I suspect that others have put us in that position. We ourselves have not put ourselves in that position because we still just focus on students. If that, for others, has put us at this kind of, hey, you're going to carry the torch a little bit here for this innovation and distance education, competency-based, student design, faculty-oriented models that are more obsessed about the students that we're serving. If others have put us in there, we're okay with that, but I would say that we have not endeavored to do that by design. We've endeavored to just ultimately do that which is right for students and increase outcomes. And yep, the scale that we have is people surely take notice of that now, and I think we believe fundamentally that scale does not work against you in terms of increasing the quality of the student experience, the likelihood of better outcomes, et cetera. It actually increases our potential to do so. So I think that's a benefit that we have now at our scale that most others don't.
And I guess, Brendan, that's kind of where I'll end too, is this idea in the U.S. that small size equals high quality, which is kind of a belief, a strong belief, I think, of the American higher education system. You know, in Canada, the top 4 universities by rankings enroll about approximately 145,000 undergraduates, 145,000 for universities. In the U.S., if you took the U.S. News and World Report national rankings, you'd have to go down to about 30 to get to that number of undergraduates, right? And so and we know the challenges of the U.S. You know, the population size, the number of more people who need a higher education, and yet what we consider prestigious higher education is not growing, right? And so if the more we can show examples, you know, and as you know, I'm affiliated with Arizona State, which also believes this, the more we can show examples of large places, whether it's Arizona State or the University of Central Florida or WGU or others, where scale can equal quality outcomes, that we always attributed only to small places, such as mentorship, right? We thought, well, you have to be in a class of only 15 students on a residential campus in the middle of nowhere for that to happen. I think that, to me, is the biggest benefit that we can see over time. And I think it's going to take time, but to me, scale is the key here.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing, although it's only about 7% of the WGU enrolled student population now, they have about, I think if I'm not mistaken here, 9,000 students that are traditional age students enrolled there now. Yeah, and it's actually similar with institutions like UMUC, again, large enrollment, but they have some 7,000 to 8,000 traditional age students enrolled in their online programs there. So an interesting question will be, right, we know it's serving the adult learner, the working adult learner, right? The question will be, is it a model that really becomes attractive for various reasons to the traditional age student? And I think time will tell.
That I might question a little bit more, but maybe that's a topic for another.
Probably traditional age.
Why I said it right at the end. There'll be no debate, and that is the end of the panel. No.
Probably a traditional age student who has a lot of adult responsibilities at the same time.
It could be. That's exactly right. But it was just interesting to see. I was surprised by those numbers and talking to leadership at UMUC and learning that at WG, again, small percentage of their enrollment, but that's bigger than the entire enrollment of my alma mater. Right.
Well, that,
you go, huh?
Not only that, for WGU, that percent has also been growing over the last 5 years, notably. And our youngest graduate, I think, to date has been 17 years old. And I know I recently approved the exception for a 14-year-old to enroll at WGU. So there are certain things that still, even at WGU, that we should not have misperceptions that this design is only for the adult learner. Competency-based education can be very effective for a variety of different learners, and it's more about the learner model than it is about, oh no, this only works for this age population or this type of individual, and it doesn't work for the emerging adult 18 to 24. You're like, I don't know. I'm willing to test that hypothesis.
Yeah.
So.
Well, more to be determined in the future. First of all, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our great panelists, and congratulations to WGU for the great work you're doing.